All right, I got a woo over there. My name is Xavier Harding. This is Mozilla's Foundation Festival 2019. This is the 10th anniversary. I'm not just some random guy. I'm a tech journalist based in New York City. I work at themarkup.org. We cover tech, its impact on society and ethics. But you're definitely not here for me. I'm not that interesting. What you're here for are the speakers and panelists, including the first one we have up for you today, Katarzyna Szymielewicz. She is the co-founder and president of the Panopticon Foundation, and she's a lawyer and activist specializing in human rights and tech. So with no further ado, Katarzyna.
Okay, so you arrived at MozFest, and it's a 10th one, not the first one, so that makes me think that you must be believers. You must be people who actually believe that a better, more humane form of technology is possible. Probably when you hear trustworthy AI, you don't think of this as another buzzword that tech people will use to sell products to their existing clients, but actually as something more ambitious than that, as a real project that we can all work towards. So I'm not here to complain that our reality is very, very different from this beautiful vision. I'm not here to tell you that this is not possible or to stop you from dreaming. If you are ready to build these solutions, just go and do it. Don't wait for people like me, lawyers, to tell you how. But I also assume that some of us might be a bit lost, that we might need some roadmaps on how to move in this better direction. I'm here today to share with you a couple of insights from my own intellectual journey, from my own struggle to imagine this better data ecosystem. Because I'm also one of the believers, I also want to move things. Just before I move them, I like to have some sense of direction I'm going in. So about directions and about roadmaps. When I start, I usually start from defining the place where I don't want to be. The spots on the map that I know only too well, and I don't want to visit them again and again and get stuck in the same paradigm. This is one of these places. Our condition of being users, which was defined by commercial actors that invited us to this space 2 decades ago, is one of these places that we don't want to visit again. This is a deeply commercial paradigm that is not really focusing on human. It's not really putting human in the center. That's a fallacy. What it really does, well, yes, it's promising choice to us, but that choice is really limited. You can only choose better privacy settings. Well, if there were privacy, but they are not even about privacy settings. But still, we remain within the same deeply commercialized paradigm where we have to accept that the key core central deal is to exchange data for a service. And that deal is not fair. Many of us accepted it a long time ago because I believe we were not fully aware of the amount of data that is actually flowing in this transaction. We probably imagined something along these lines, that we feed the system with the data of our choice, that we tell it what we want the system to know about us. But by now, obviously we know that the reality is different, is much more complicated. That the key element of this transaction is something that Shoshana Zuboff defined as behavioral surplus. And in this tech bubble, we've been discussing this flow of data for a very long time. This is the whole number of metadata observations made about humans, how we move, how we interact, how we click, how we think, how we react to content that is presented to us. And this is what really feeds these systems with real knowledge. This is what gives its power over us humans, because it generates these observations generated by billions of people at that point. They really generate extremely valuable knowledge about humankind. It's a big word, but I think that's exactly what it is. And when you go deeper in that knowledge, this is when it gets really interesting. This is when you find all these predictions, all this intelligent guessing, all the inferred hidden data that we would never agree to reveal, like our health condition, our psychometric profile, our vulnerabilities, life changes, life choices, difficult situations we go through, all sorts of vulnerabilities that can be used and are used against us. Obviously, we know why this knowledge is generated. It is generated for the sake of influence. It is there for commercial actors to come with money, buy tools like targeted advertising, or buy plays in the newsfeed that we will watch, and influence us, influence our choices. This is not a fair deal. In this deal, we are constantly observed on one hand and constantly targeted on the other hand. We understand this by now, but do we really accept this? I don't, and that's why I suggest that we move to something else. But before we move to something else, this is more or less how I see existing data ecosystem, the deeply commercialized one, when service is just a smokescreen for influence. Service is just something that we are seduced with, that we are attracted with to play this game. But really, we are the targets, and we are constantly being influenced. And our data is used as a tool of power against us. This is something that we want to depart from. But it's very tricky how to leave that condition. It's very tricky for yet another reason, which can be summarized in the following way, that the same powerful actors, the same dominating companies today control both the storage of your data, all the data you generate, and all the data that is generated about you, all the content you put in the system, and the interpretation of this data, the story that is told by this data. I came up with this very simple way of explaining it thanks to Amir Baradar, an artist and a storyteller based in New York, who helped me with this in one brainstorm. So I owe this to Amir. And I think it's a great way of explaining the very complex power that we are subjected to. Yes, right now, storage and story is controlled by the same entity, but it doesn't have to be this way, right? I can imagine that there is a split between the two. There is a crack in which we can start introducing new actors like ourselves. We can start creating different types of, well, maybe not services, maybe experiences that are not services, that are between the data stored by one entity and a story told by another, or a story told by us. This is the kind of shifting power that I really want to see. And then, if that happens, I can imagine that the new data ecosystem starts delivering value, not service, that we stop thinking in these deeply commercialized terms where it's all about the service. Let's imagine the world without business models. I think it should also be possible, not to eliminate them, but just not to get stuck in thinking that we need a business model for everything. What about solving societal problems? We have so many of them, right? And we've been dreaming about data becoming a tool for these solutions. How about we just start doing it? Or how about delivering a very personal value to us? Something that, like playing with data, like being creative with data, being playful without thinking immediately of us as prosumers who will create new services. I think that new roles, new patterns of using data should become possible if only we create that crack, we create that space, and we get control over data. Sure, I mean, it gets complicated in this point. I'm aware of this. So in my picture of a better data ecosystem, data clearly remains in the center, clearly is an important element of the whole thing. But the power dynamics around this and the potential roles and patterns of using it can be very different. They could be very different if we got the real control over data. I'm not going to give you today an answer for how to get there. If I had it, I would come with a final solution, and I'm coming with some form of a roadmap, hoping that also we as a movement, not as individuals sitting in closed rooms, but as a movement can come up with some. But I have one idea that I can test, something that we can imagine as possibility on the way, which I call regulated API. I'm thinking about new type of interface which opens access to data that is now controlled by these dominant platforms, but the biggest players. And that access to data becomes non-discriminatory, becomes open to everybody who want to play with data, be creative with data, create own services, question the existing services. Why I'm saying this, why I need a new API. If all of you know this, we have APIs for developers that work quite well for the market. That's exactly the problem. We have APIs that work for the market, for commercial services. that transfer money from developers to dominating platforms. If I don't want to talk about money, if I want to imagine non-commercial solutions, then I'm stuck in a user role. I'm stuck in a role of somebody who is sitting in a passive position with these privacy settings and can only click yes or no or go away. I want a different situation. I want API that can give access to us as users, well, maybe no longer users, maybe problem solvers or simply citizens, and also give access to public service providers who have the courage to offer non-commercial solutions. We need a regulator in this game, because without a regulator, I'm afraid that the existing dominant companies will simply fool us into something which is not a truthful picture of the data they generated about us. It's not a full picture. The third layer I was showing you on the graph is still invisible, it's still non-transparent, and I want to see it. I want to be able to correct it, to discuss with it, to modify the story that is told about me based on my data. And for that thing, I need this new API. And if we have it, if we have that situation where we control data and where we have some kind of interface which is independent from existing dominant players, then we can imagine different use cases. I can imagine a municipality solving transportation problem with Uber data. I can imagine a healthcare provider learning from Google search data about the next disease coming up and enrolling vaccination programs. And I can imagine myself correcting my profile to get better newsfeed of my choice. And I can imagine us as movement creating non-commercial solutions that might modify newsfeeds of all sorts, not just on Facebook, but basically the content people receive, modify algorithms that curate this content to solve certain problems, like disinformation or hate speech or gender issues or LGBTQ issues. We could solve them by curating content in a different way if we can access this data ecosystem as active agents, as co-creators and not just passive users. So these kind of scenarios I have in mind when I imagine this new deal on data. And yes, I do think it is possible. I think it must be possible. The question here is whether it will be possible as a market-driven project, something with commercial business in mind, or whether it has to be a political project. If that's the latter, if we think about this as a political project, then we need somebody to deliver it. I cannot right now think of any better place than European Union. And honestly, if they propose a Green New Deal, why wouldn't they propose New Deal on data? Or maybe other societal problems and solves them all together as one package. I think it's clearly an ambitious project, but a realistic one. We only need to generate some political will, and this is my job, this is what I'm doing in Panopticon Foundation. Thanks for listening, and I hope we can discuss the roadmap together.
All right. So we can now open it up to audience Q&A. If anybody has any questions for Katarzyna? Anybody? Have any questions? I think you did such a good job that nobody has...
counter ideas.
Yeah,
right. Yeah, oh, see, no.
It sounds like it's going to be a very, very challenging thing to do in terms of
Oh, we have a mic coming, by the way.
So I'm more than sure that companies won't be willing to give their hard-earned data just for free. So how would you kind of incentivize people to be aware of it and to make politicians aware of it as well? Because politicians tend to be not up to date usually, most of the time. So how would we do that? Because that requires a lot of effort. I don't expect it to answer it perfectly and to know all the answers, but it would be encouraging to know at least somehow how we do that.
Thanks, good question. Yes, I don't have all the answers, but I have some. First, we have GDPR, we have data protection law that actually gives us even today right to fully access all the layers of this profile I was drawing. It just doesn't work because companies refuse it, but the law is already there. So if we come to this ecosystem, if we start using these APIs as data subjects, as people who come to access own data, companies cannot really say no. They already have legal obligation to reveal it, to even move it if we request. They just don't do it. or do it partially. So on one hand, it is about using existing laws, but in a more forceful way, or putting another form of supervision, another regulator for this digital market to basically force them to do so. On the other hand, it is about a new form of market regulation. You can think about energy or gas or broadcasting, different markets that were regulated in the past in a similar way, where a regulator was created to supervise it and say, hey, certain harms caused by the current ecosystem have to be prevented. And that thinking is quite mature, and it's quite mature on both sides of the Atlantic. I keep seeing headlines also in US-based media about, well, chopping them up, breaking them up. I'm not a big fan of this scenario. I think we should rather leave the data where it is, in a sense that I don't want to destroy the knowledge generated by these platforms. I want to be able to build on their infrastructure something better and more humane and more delivering value to us. So even without destroying these existing structures, we can expect them to share a lot of the knowledge they generate under this paradigm that, you know, either regulators come and destroy them, or they start delivering some kind of societal value. And that thinking is quite mature. Also in European Commission, when you see the current composition of it, there is Margaret Vestager, quite famous for having that thinking also in past 5 years. So I think politically, it's becoming really realistic that we have that move, that push.
Oh, we'll bring a microphone over to you.
Thank you. I'm very uncomfortable about the idea of people controlling their data. Companies like big data because they consider it more objective, because the data we put online, we often lie, particularly about sensitive issues like race and sex and other issues. Could you just talk about how you see us controlling our data so that we can be, the data can be objective and we're not just lying to everybody?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think it's so easy to lie these days. I think that's exactly why this system of power and influence works so well today, because even if we try to lie, even if we try to modify this first layer with some intelligent picture of ourselves, it's not really going to... The algorithms know that we lie. They know that we are different in reality. And for me, it's not about creating more space for us to lie or to avoid, showcasing our real selves. It really is about us controlling how that knowledge is then used, right? I have nothing against this knowledge being generated. I have a lot against this knowledge being used to influence me without my consent and awareness. So that's why I'm advocating for control. I'm not advocating for control to help people hide or help people avoid being visible online. The control mechanism I have in mind is really about deciding how that knowledge about us can then become useful for society rather than for these companies. And it doesn't have to be a individual controlling her data. It doesn't have to be all of us extremely busy every day, using data management systems. I don't buy this scenario. I rather think about some forms of data trust or collective organizations, non-profit organizations that we trust. We let them know how we want to be managed, our data, how we want to manage it, and they do it for us. I think that's a new service model or non-profit model, depends which one you prefer, that can be really generated.
We have time for one more? We have time for one more. Yeah, right here in the front.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to explore a bit more where you see politically that this is going to be picked up most. In the US, there is a bill now being floated or thought about regarding data portability, which is building sort of on what's in the GDPR regarding data portability. On the other hand, we see the new commission in the EU talking a lot about legislation regarding AI-related things. Which part do you think this, as a political movement, would link in most strongly?
I strongly believe that we have to think about both of them, and they have to be in communication. These companies mostly are based or come from the US, but they also operate in Europe, and they will not ignore Europe. Europe is still far too big and a wealthy market to be ignored. So it probably has to be a dialogue or a concert of these two major powers. European Union also has something else on the table, which is called the Digital Services Act. I believe we will talk about more about this tomorrow in a panel with actually a person from the European Commission working on that thing. So that's the first political, realistically speaking, moment or place where we can expect some of these changes to be introduced, not all of them. I use this metaphor with having digital emperors. Today it's, Facebooks and Googles of this world, they behave like emperors, and we can either impose constitution on them, and that's the next coming legislation from the EU, or we can take some power from the emperors, hopefully removing the emperors at some point. That second shift in power is far more difficult, and I think that's the next deal together with the US. Some kind of breaking up, some kind of functional separation, like I suggest, data from service or data from interface layer. I really think it's doable and thinkable.
Nice. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Katarzyna Shamielovich, everyone give her a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking.
Thank you.
Yeah.